Sarah, when most 14-year-olds are worried about high school crushes and weekend plans, your parents drove you to what they believed was a spiritual retreat. What do you remember about that last car ride to the compound? 20 years, Sarah. But here's what I need to know. What finally gave you the strength to risk everything and run?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Sarah, I want to take our listeners back to the very beginning. You mentioned your parents thought they were sending you to a religious retreat. Can you paint a picture of what your home life was like before that decision was made? What changed for them? What made them feel they needed to seek outside help?
I think they were overwhelmed. I was their only child, and I'd started questioning everything around 13, 14, not just typical teenage rebellion, but deep questions about faith, about why we went to church every Sunday when the pastor seemed more interested in the collection plate than helping people. They'd raised me to think critically, but when I started applying that thinking to their beliefs, it scared them.
So they were looking for somewhere to help guide you spiritually?
Exactly. They received a pamphlet in the mail, beautiful glossy photos of rolling hills and young people working in gardens, studying scripture together. The letter talked about a place where troubled youth could find purpose and connection with God away from the distractions of modern society. The facility was called Shepherd's Rest.
Tell me about that name. Did it feel comforting to them?
Oh, absolutely. My mother kept that pamphlet on the kitchen counter for weeks, and I'd catch her looking at it while she drank her morning coffee. She'd trace her finger over the pictures of smiling families, parents embracing their children during what looked like visiting day. The language was so carefully crafted, Tony. It spoke directly to parents who felt they were losing their children to a world they couldn't control.
What was your reaction when they first showed it to you?
I was curious, honestly. The photos looked peaceful, and I was tired of the tension at home. Every dinner conversation had become a minefield. They'd ask about school. I'd mention something I'd learned in science class that contradicted their biblical interpretation, and the evening would dissolve into arguments. Part of me thought maybe some time away would help us all find our footing again.
So you were somewhat willing to go?
I was 14, Tony. I trusted my parents completely, even when we disagreed. When they sat me down and explained that they'd found a place where I could explore my faith more deeply while getting excellent academic instruction, it sounded like an adventure. They told me it was a 6-month program, maybe a year at most.
Can you describe the day they drove you there?
Long pause. It was early September, just as the leaves were starting to turn. We drove for hours through increasingly rural countryside. My mother packed my favorite foods for the trip, peanut butter sandwiches cut into triangles the way she'd done since I was small, and thermos of hot chocolate even though it wasn't that cold yet. My father kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, asking if I was excited, if I had any questions.
What did the facility look like when you first arrived? It must have seemed idyllic.
It did. The first person who greeted us was a woman named Rebecca. She was maybe 40, with graying hair pulled back in a simple bun and the kindest eyes I'd ever seen. She hugged my parents like old friends and then knelt down to my level, even though I was already taller than she was, and welcomed me personally. She asked about my interests, my favorite subjects in school, what I hoped to learn during my time there.
How did your parents respond to Rebecca?
They were immediately at ease. You could see the relief washing over them as Rebecca walked us around the grounds, showing us the library with its floor-to-ceiling windows, the dining hall where families of young people were sharing a meal together, laughing and talking. She introduced us to other parents who were visiting, and they all spoke glowingly about the changes they'd seen in their children.
Did you meet any of the other young people that first day?
A few. There was a girl about my age named Jennifer who showed me the dormitory where I'd be staying. She seemed happy, well-adjusted. She told me about the classes they offered, not just religious studies, but literature, mathematics, even art and music. She showed me her room, which was simple but comfortable, with handmade quilts on the beds and shelves lined with books.
What was the goodbye like with your parents?
Pause. Harder than I expected. My mother cried, but not in a way that alarmed me. It felt normal, like sending a child off to summer camp. My father shook hands with Rebecca and made her promise to call if I needed anything. They told me they loved me, that they'd write every week, and that they'd see me soon for the first family visiting day.
When was that supposed to be?
6 weeks away. Rebecca assured them that the initial adjustment period was important, that too much outside contact in the beginning could interfere with the spiritual growth process. She explained it like a detox from the overwhelming stimulation of regular society. It made perfect sense to all of us at the time.
Sarah, as you're describing this, I'm struck by how carefully orchestrated it all seems. Looking back now, can you see the manipulation that was happening?
Oh, absolutely. But Tony, these people were masters. Everything they did was designed to appear loving, supportive, spiritually grounded. Rebecca never said anything that was technically a lie. There were educational programs. There was spiritual instruction. There were opportunities for growth. She just didn't mention that questioning any of it would result in punishment, or that leaving wasn't actually an option.
Tell me about those first few weeks. When did you start to sense something was wrong?
It was gradual. The first red flag was the mail situation. Jennifer had told me we could write letters home, but when I asked about mailing a letter to my parents after my first week, I was told that all correspondence went through a review process to ensure it reflected proper spiritual growth. That seemed odd, but the staff member explained it as protecting families from unnecessary worry during the adjustment period.
What was the daily routine like?
Structured, which I actually appreciated at first. We woke at 5:30 for morning meditation and prayer. Breakfast was communal, simple but nutritious. Then academic classes until lunch, more religious instruction in the afternoon, dinner together, and evening reflection time. Everyone seemed engaged, purposeful. It felt like what I imagined monastery life might be like.
When did you first try to contact your parents directly?
About 3 weeks in, I was feeling homesick and asked to use a telephone. I was told that phone calls required advance approval and were only permitted in cases of emergency. When I pressed and said I was having a hard time adjusting, Rebecca herself sat down with me for what felt like a counseling session.
What was that conversation like?
She was so understanding, Tony. She normalized my feelings completely, told me that homesickness was a natural part of spiritual growth, that it meant I was letting go of earthly attachments in order to develop a deeper relationship with God. She held my hands while she talked and spoke about her own struggles when she first came to the community years earlier.
She had been there for years?
That's what she told me. She said she'd arrived as a young woman, lost and searching, and had found such peace and purpose that she'd never wanted to leave. She described the outside world as chaotic and spiritually empty, and painted the community as a refuge from all of that darkness.
Were there other adults there who had similar stories?
Several. All the staff members spoke about arriving at Shepherd's Rest during difficult periods in their lives and discovering a sense of belonging they'd never experienced before. They talked about their former lives with pity, as if they'd been sleepwalking through meaningless existences before finding true enlightenment.
Looking back, do you think these people genuinely believed what they were telling you?
Some of them, yes. I think Rebecca truly believed she was saving lost souls. But there were others, people in leadership positions, who knew exactly what they were doing. You could see it in how they watched us, how they took notes during our conversations, how they strategically paired certain young people with certain staff members based on our individual vulnerabilities.
You mentioned a leader earlier. When did you first encounter this person?
Long pause. His name was David, and he didn't make himself known to new arrivals immediately. It was almost like you had to earn the privilege of meeting him. About a month in, I was told that I'd been selected to attend a special evening gathering where David would be speaking about advanced spiritual principles.
What was your first impression of him?
Magnetic doesn't begin to cover it, Tony. He was maybe 50, with silver hair and the most intense blue eyes I'd ever seen. When he spoke, every person in that room hung on his words. He talked about the corruption of the outside world, about how families unknowingly poisoned their children with materialism and false values. He made everyone feel chosen, special, saved from a fate worse than death.
How did he speak about your parents specifically?
Not at first. But over the following weeks, in smaller group sessions, he began to help us understand that our homesickness was actually spiritual warfare. He explained that our attachments to family members who didn't share our newfound enlightenment were chains holding us back from our true purpose. He made missing your parents feel like a moral failing.
Sarah, I have to ask, because I know this is difficult territory. How did you endure 20 years in that environment?
Very long pause you adapt, Tony. The human spirit is remarkably resilient, but also remarkably fragile. They broke us down so systematically, so gradually, that by the time you realized what was happening, you no longer trusted your own perceptions enough to act on them. And there were beautiful moments, too. Genuine connections with other people who were suffering alongside you. That's what made it so confusing. Real love and real horror existing in the same place.
Sarah, I want to take our listeners back to the very beginning. You mentioned your parents thought they were sending you to a religious retreat. Can you paint a picture of what that first day looked like when you arrived at what you later learned was called Haven's Gate? What were your first impressions of the people who greeted you?
That's where the facade started to crack, though I was too young to recognize it then. This woman named Rebecca met us at the main gate. She had this serene smile that never wavered, not once during the entire intake process. Her eyes were different, though. Looking back now, I realized they were completely empty. She spoke in this soft, measured tone about spiritual growth and finding my true purpose. My parents ate it up.
How did your parents react to leaving you there?
My mother cried, but she kept saying it was for my own good. I'd been acting out, questioning everything about our faith back home. They thought a few months of structured spiritual guidance would straighten me out. My father shook hands with Rebecca like they were conducting a business transaction. He told me to be respectful and listen to my elders. Then they drove away.
What happened immediately after they left?
The transformation was instant, Tony. The moment that Van disappeared down the dirt road, Rebecca's demeanor shifted completely. That gentle voice became crisp and authoritative. She led me to what she called the orientation building, but it felt more like being processed. They took my clothes, my few personal belongings, even a small cross necklace my grandmother had given me. Everything that connected me to the outside world.
Tell me about the other people you encountered that first day.
The other residents moved like ghosts. They all wore the same plain gray clothing, and when they spoke, it was in these hushed, reverent tones. Everyone called the leader Father David, though he couldn't have been more than 40 at the time. The way people's faces changed when his name was mentioned. There was this mixture of adoration and terror that I couldn't understand then.
Did you meet Father David that first day?
Not directly. I saw him from across the dining hall during evening meal. He sat at this elevated table while everyone else sat on long wooden benches. The silence in that room was absolute, except for his voice. He would speak about purity and sacrifice while we ate this thin vegetable broth and stale bread. I remember being so hungry, but no one dared ask for more food.
What about the living arrangements? Where did they place you?
The dormitory was this long, narrow building with about 20 beds lined up in perfect rows. No privacy, no personal space. I was assigned a bed between two women who introduced themselves only by their new spiritual names. Sarah wasn't even my real name back then, Tony. They stripped that away from me, too, said my birth name carried the contamination of the outside world.
So, Sarah is the name they gave you at the Commune?
Yes. It was chosen for me because of the biblical Sarah's obedience to Abraham. They said it would help shape my character toward proper submission. Hearing my parents' names for me erased felt like losing the last thread connecting me to who I had been. I cried that first night, trying to muffle the sound in my pillow, but the woman next to me whispered that tears were selfish, that I should be grateful for the opportunity to be reborn.
What did a typical day look like in those early weeks?
We woke before dawn to the sound of that bell tower. Morning prayers lasted 2 hours, kneeling on the hard wooden floor of what they called the sanctuary. Then breakfast, which was usually the same thin porridge. The rest of the day was divided between manual labor and spiritual instruction. I was assigned to the gardens at first, pulling weeds under the supervision of older members who watched our every movement.
Did you have any sense at that point that something was fundamentally wrong?
The pieces were there, but I was 14 and completely overwhelmed. The constant surveillance felt oppressive, but they framed it as caring guidance. The restricted diet was called purification. The isolation from the outside world was described as protection from worldly corruption. They had an answer for everything that made you feel guilty for questioning.
What about the spiritual instruction you mentioned?
Those sessions were where the real psychological manipulation happened, though I wouldn't understand that for years. Father David would pace around our small group, speaking in this hypnotic rhythm about surrendering our will to the divine plan. He had this way of making eye contact that felt like he could see straight through you. Hours and hours of this, until your mind felt completely blank.
Did you try to contact your parents during those first weeks?
I asked about calling home constantly. Rebecca would pat my shoulder and explain that outside contact disrupted the spiritual cleansing process. She said my parents had been informed of this policy and trusted the community's wisdom. Later, I learned they had been receiving forged letters supposedly written by me, describing how happy and spiritually fulfilled I was.
How did the other residents treat you as a newcomer?
With a mixture of pity and envy. Pity because they remembered their own early struggles, and envy because I hadn't yet been broken down completely. There was this woman, maybe in her 30s, who had been there for over a decade. She would watch me with these sad eyes during meals, but she never spoke directly to me. Speaking to newcomers without permission was against the rules.
When did you first realize that this might not be a temporary situation?
About 6 weeks in, I overheard 2 of the senior members talking about someone who had been there for 15 years. 15 years, Tony. That's when the reality started to sink in. This wasn't a retreat or a reform program. This was a prison disguised as salvation. That night, lying in that dormitory listening to 20 women breathing in perfect unison, I began planning my first escape attempt.
We're going to talk more about those escape attempts in our next segment, but before we move on, I want to ask you about hope. During those early weeks, what kept you going?
The memory of my grandmother's voice, strange as that sounds. She used to tell me stories about women who survived impossible circumstances through sheer stubborn will. I would replay her words in my head during the longest prayer sessions, holding on to them like a lifeline. I refused to believe that 14-year-old girl was going to disappear forever into that gray, silent world.
That strength of spirit would serve you well in the years ahead. When we return, Sarah will tell us about life under Father David's increasingly controlling regime and her dangerous first attempt at freedom. Sarah, I want to understand what drew your parents to this place initially. What did they think they were sending you to?
Long pause my parents were searching, Tony. They'd been through a difficult divorce when I was 12, and both of them were grappling with guilt, looking for something that promised healing. The Commune called itself New Eden Fellowship back then. They had these beautiful brochures with pictures of gardens, young people reading by streams, families working together. It looked like summer camp meets spiritual retreat.
How did they first encounter this group?
Through a friend at my mother's grief counseling group. This woman, she spoke about how her troubled teenage son had been transformed after spending time there. She said he'd found peace, purpose, direction. My parents were desperate to give me stability after everything we'd been through. They thought 6 months would help me process their divorce and find some grounding.
What do you remember about that initial conversation when they told you about it?
I remember sitting in our kitchen on a Sunday afternoon. The light was coming through the yellow curtains my mother loved, and she was making her special pancakes. She and my father sat across from me at that old wooden table, both looking so hopeful. They said it would be like a retreat where I could heal from all the family upheaval, learn life skills, and connect with nature. They promised it was temporary.
Did anything feel off to you then, or did it genuinely seem appealing?
At 14, honestly, part of me was curious. I'd been struggling with their divorce, acting out at school, feeling angry all the time. The idea of getting away from the tension at home, being somewhere peaceful, it didn't sound terrible, but there was something in how they presented it that felt rehearsed, like they'd been coached on what to say.
Tell me about the day they took you there.
Pause. It was early October. I remember because the leaves were just starting to turn, and I thought about how beautiful it would be to watch them change somewhere new. We drove for hours into rural Pennsylvania, deeper and deeper into areas where the houses became fewer and the woods grew thicker. The compound sat on maybe 300 acres, surrounded by dense forest and hills.
What was your first impression when you arrived?
It was stunning, I have to admit. Log buildings scattered around a central meadow, vegetable gardens, a small lake that reflected the sky like glass. People were working quietly in the gardens, and there was this sense of order and calm that felt almost magical after the chaos at home. A woman named Rebecca greeted us with this warm smile and fresh-baked bread. Everything smelled like pine and wood smoke.
How did your parents seem during this handover?
That's what I've never been able to forget, Tony. They seemed relieved, not sad or worried like you'd expect parents leaving their child somewhere for months. Relieved. Rebecca walked them around, showing them the dormitories, the schoolroom, the workshop where kids learned carpentry. She spoke about structure, discipline, spiritual growth. My parents nodded along like they'd finally found the solution to a problem they'd been carrying.
Did you meet any other young people that first day?
A few. There was this boy, maybe 16, who helped carry my bags to the dormitory. He moved differently than teenagers I knew. Very careful, very quiet. When I tried to joke with him about something, he just smiled politely and kept walking. And there were these twin girls, probably my age, working in the garden. They looked healthy and content, but when I waved, they glanced around nervously before waving back.
What about the leadership? Did you meet anyone in charge that first day?
Rebecca introduced me to Brother Samuel. That's what everyone called him. He was probably in his 50s then, with silver hair and these incredibly intense blue eyes. He had this way of looking at you like he could see straight through to your soul. He shook my parents' hands, placed his hand on my shoulder, and spoke about how I was entering a sacred space where I could leave behind the corruption of the outside world and discover my true purpose.
How did your parents respond to him?
They were captivated, Tony, completely drawn in by his presence. He spoke about how the modern world was poisoning young minds with materialism and moral confusion. He promised them I would learn discipline, respect, and spiritual clarity. He made it sound like I was the lucky one, being chosen for this special opportunity to grow in a pure environment.
What was the actual goodbye like?
Long pause, quick? Too quick. Rebecca suggested that prolonged goodbyes only made transitions harder for everyone. My mother hugged me and whispered that she loved me, and this would help me become strong. My father shook my hand like I was going off to college. They drove away before dinner, and I remember standing in that meadow, watching their car disappear into the trees, feeling completely alone for the first time in my life.
Did you have any sense that evening that something wasn't right?
The first hint was when I asked Rebecca when I could call them to let them know I'd settled in okay. She smiled and explained that outside communication disrupted the healing process, that I needed to focus entirely on my inner work without the distractions of my previous life. She said after I'd had time to adjust and grow, we'd discuss contact with my family.
How did that sit with you?
It felt strange, but not alarming yet. I was 14, and adults were always setting rules I didn't understand. Plus, part of me wasn't eager to talk to my parents anyway. I figured a few weeks of silence might even be good for all of us.
If you could go back and tell your 14-year-old self one thing in that moment.
Pause. I'd tell her to run. Right then, that first night. Before the rules became clear, before the fear set in, before 20 years disappeared, I'd tell her that sometimes what looks like sanctuary is actually a prison, and the most beautiful cages are often the hardest to escape. Long pause. I was in my bedroom doing homework. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, and I remember because I had a math test the next day that I was nervous about. My mother called me downstairs, and both my parents were sitting at the kitchen table with these serious expressions.
What did they say to you?
My father cleared his throat the way he always did when he was uncomfortable. He said they had wonderful news, that they'd found a place where I could grow spiritually and academically, a special community where young people could flourish away from all the negative influences of the world.
How did you react to that?
I was confused at first. I asked what they meant by community, and my mother got this bright, almost manic smile. She started talking about how I'd be surrounded by like-minded families, how I'd have structure and purpose. She kept using words like blessed and chosen.
Did they explain how long you'd be there?
That's when I started to feel sick to my stomach. My father said it would be for as long as it took for me to complete my education and spiritual development. When I asked what that meant exactly, they exchanged this look. My mother said some young people stayed until they were 18, others longer, depending on their progress.
You must have had questions about school, your friends.
I did. I started asking about my classes, about graduation, about college. And Tony, this is the part that still haunts me. My mother's face just went cold. She said I was being selfish, that I was too focused on worldly things. She said this community would teach me what really mattered.
How long did you have before you were supposed to leave?
3 days. They told me on Tuesday, and I was supposed to be ready by Friday morning. 3 days to pack up my entire life, though they were very specific about what I could and couldn't bring.
What were you allowed to take?
Basic clothes, nothing too colorful or revealing. A few personal items, but no electronics, no music, no books except for approved religious texts. I wasn't even allowed to bring my diary, which broke my heart because I'd been writing in it since I was 10.
Did you try to resist, to argue with them?
Oh, I tried everything, Tony. I cried, I pleaded. I promised to be better at home. I even offered to start going to church more regularly. But the more I fought, the more convinced they became that this was exactly what I needed.
What about reaching out to other family members or friends?
I tried calling my grandmother that night, but my parents had already spoken to everyone. They'd painted this picture of me as a troubled teenager who was heading down a dangerous path. My grandmother actually congratulated me on the phone, said she was proud of my parents for taking such decisive action.
That must have felt like a complete betrayal.
It was devastating. The people I trusted most in the world had orchestrated this together. I remember lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was all a nightmare.
Did your parents give you any details about the place itself?
Very few. They said it was in a beautiful rural location, that the community was self-sufficient and peaceful. They showed me a brochure with pictures of gardens and smiling families. Everything looked so wholesome and normal.
Was there any mention of the leader or the structure of this community?
They mentioned a man they called Brother Marcus, who they said was a wise spiritual guide. They spoke about him with this reverence that should have been a red flag. They said he had special insights into helping young people overcome their worldly attachments.
Looking back now, do you see signs you missed?
The signs were there, but I was 14, Tony. When your parents tell you something is good for you, you want to believe them. I kept thinking maybe it would be like summer camp, that I'd make friends and be home by Christmas.
What happened on that Friday morning?
A van pulled up to our house at 6 in the morning. There were 2 men and a woman, all dressed very simply, very plain. They had these calm, almost serene expressions that never changed. They spoke softly to my parents about what a wonderful decision this was.
How did you feel seeing that van?
Pure terror. It became real in that moment. This wasn't something my parents were considering anymore. It was happening. I was actually leaving everything I knew.
Did you have a chance to say goodbye to anyone else?
My parents said goodbyes had already been said, that dwelling on earthly attachments would make the transition harder. They hugged me at the front door and promised this was an act of love. My mother was crying, but she said they were tears of joy.
What was going through your mind as you got into that van?
I kept thinking someone would stop this, that a neighbor would see and ask questions, or that my parents would change their minds at the last second. But everyone just watched me get into a van with complete strangers like it was the most normal thing in the world.
And that was the beginning of 20 years.
Pause. That was the last time I saw my bedroom, my neighborhood, my old life. I pressed my face against the van window and watched everything I knew disappear behind me. I had no idea I wouldn't see any of it again until I was 34 years old.
Sarah, you mentioned that life at the compound had settled into a routine by your second year there. You were attending classes, working in the gardens, participating in the community meetings. From the outside, it might have looked almost normal.
That's exactly what made it so insidious, Tony. By 15, I had convinced myself that maybe this was just how life worked. The fear from those first months had dulled into this constant low-level anxiety that felt normal. I was learning to read the leader's moods, to anticipate what would make him angry, to blend in.
What was a typical day like for you during that period?
We woke at 5 for morning prayers. Then breakfast, which was usually oatmeal or bread if we were lucky. The younger people like me would spend mornings in what they called education, though it was really just memorizing scripture and the leader's teachings. Afternoons were work detail. I was assigned to the vegetable gardens most days.
And you said there were other young people there. Did you form friendships?
Pause. There was this girl about my age. She'd been there since she was 12. At first, she seemed like she could be a friend, someone who understood. We would work side by side in the gardens, and sometimes she would whisper small things. Complaints about the food or how tired she was.
That must have felt like a lifeline, having someone your own age to connect with.
I thought so too. For weeks I started to trust her. I even began to share some of my own doubts. How I missed my parents, how I didn't understand why we couldn't write letters home. Small things, Tony, but in that place, even small doubts felt dangerous to voice.
What happened with this friendship?
Long pause. One evening in late October, I was called to the leader's private office. I'd never been summoned there before, and my stomach dropped the moment I heard my name announced at dinner.
You knew something was wrong.
The walk to his office felt endless. It was in the main building, past the communal areas, down a hallway that always smelled like incense and something else I couldn't identify. Fear, maybe. When I knocked on his door, his voice was so calm when he told me to enter.
What did you find when you went in?
He was sitting behind this enormous wooden desk, and there were 2 of the senior members standing on either side of him. The girl from the garden was there too, sitting in a chair facing his desk. She wouldn't look at me when I walked in.
Pause. She had told them about your conversations.
Every single word, Tony. He repeated back to me things I had whispered while we were pulling weeds. Private thoughts about missing home. Questions I had asked about why the gates were always locked. Even a comment I had made about the food. She had been reporting everything to them.
How did that feel, Sarah? To realize someone you trusted had been documenting your words?
Voice quiet. It broke something in me that I didn't even know could break. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated. This girl had looked me in the eyes every day, had nodded sympathetically when I shared my loneliness, and all the while she was storing up ammunition to use against me.
What did the leader say to you?
He told me that loyalty was the most important virtue in their community, that questioning the wisdom of their way of life was a sickness that needed to be cured. He said that doubt was contagious, and that I had been trying to infect others with my spiritual weakness.
And the punishment for this doubt?
3 days in what they called reflection isolation. A small room in the basement of the main building with no windows, no bed, just a bucket and a single meal each day. They said it would help me understand the darkness I was bringing into their sacred space.
3 days alone with your thoughts after that betrayal.
Those 3 days changed everything, Tony. Sitting in that darkness, I realized that trust was a luxury I could never afford again in that place. But more than that, I understood for the first time that this wasn't a temporary situation. No one was coming to get me. My parents thought I was safe and happy. If I was ever going to leave, I would have to find a way myself.
That was the moment you started planning your escape.
Not planning, not yet. But it was the moment I stopped trying to adapt and started trying to survive. And survival, I was beginning to understand, meant never letting anyone see who I really was again.
Sarah, you've mentioned that the commune had strict rules from day one, but I'm curious about how people adapted to such dramatic changes in their lives. How did you personally respond when you realized this wasn't the temporary retreat your parents had promised?
Long pause. You know, Tony, at 14, your mind tries to make sense of things that don't make sense. The first few weeks, I kept telling myself it was just an extended program. Maybe my parents needed more time to sort things out at home. I created these elaborate stories in my head about why I couldn't call them.
That sounds like a survival mechanism. Your mind was protecting you from a reality too harsh to accept.
Exactly. But the human spirit is strange, isn't it? Some people crumbled immediately when they understood the truth. Others fought back right away and ended up in what they called the reflection chambers. Me? I became a chameleon.
Tell me more about that adaptation. What did becoming a chameleon look like?
I learned to read the room before I even entered it. If Brother Marcus was having a difficult day, I could sense it from his posture during morning assembly. If Sister Catherine was monitoring the dormitories, I knew to keep my head down and speak only when spoken to. I developed this hypervigilance that probably saved my life but nearly destroyed my sense of self.
That level of constant alertness must have been exhausting. How did it affect your relationships with other members?
Sighs. That's where things got complicated, Tony. See, there were the lifers and the newcomers. The lifers had been there for years. Some since childhood, like myself, eventually became. They'd developed their own ways of surviving, and many had completely bought into the system. Then you had people like Maria.
Maria sounds significant. Can you tell me about her?
Maria arrived about 3 years after I did. She was older, maybe mid-20s, and she'd been through something traumatic before coming to the compound. Her family thought the commune would heal her, give her purpose. But Maria never quite surrendered the way the leaders wanted.
How did that manifest? What made her different?
She asked questions. Not openly defiant ones, but careful, thoughtful questions that made you think. Like when Brother Marcus would talk about sacrifice and devotion, Maria might quietly ask me later, "But what about joy? Doesn't faith include joy?" Simple questions that planted seeds.
It sounds like she became important to you during a vulnerable time.
Voice softening Maria became the sister I never had. But that relationship taught me something painful about how isolation and control work, Tony. The leaders, they had this way of identifying who mattered to whom, and they used those connections as leverage.
What do you mean by leverage?
If I stepped out of line, they wouldn't punish me directly. They'd assign Maria to extra kitchen duties or have her spend days in silent meditation. If she asked too many questions, suddenly I'd find myself on cleaning detail for the livestock areas. We learned to protect each other by being perfect, which meant we were essentially policing ourselves.
That's a sophisticated form of psychological manipulation. How did this dynamic affect your thoughts about escape during those early years?
Pause. That's the insidious part. For a long time, I didn't even think about escape because leaving would mean abandoning Maria, and she felt the same way about me. We were trapped not just by walls and rules, but by our own humanity. Our capacity to love became another chain.
When you say you became a chameleon earlier, I'm starting to understand that it wasn't just about surviving the leader's moods. You were also navigating these complex relationships with fellow members.
Absolutely. There were so many unspoken alliances and resentments. Some people genuinely believed in the mission and saw questioners like Maria as threats to their spiritual progress. Others were just as trapped as we were, but had given up hope. You learned to present different versions of yourself, depending on who was watching and listening.
All of this emotional labor, this constant adaptation, how did it change you as a person during those formative years?
Voice becoming quieter. I lost myself, Tony, completely. By the time I was 18, I couldn't tell you what I actually believed about anything, what foods I liked, what made me laugh, what I dreamed about. I'd become this perfect mirror, reflecting back whatever the situation required. The only time I felt real was during stolen moments with Maria, and even then, we had to be so careful.
Sarah, what you're describing sounds like a complete dissolution of identity. How does someone come back from that?
Long pause. That's the question I'm still answering every day. But I think it started with Maria making a choice that changed everything between us.
Sarah, I want to talk about something that might be difficult. You mentioned earlier that people responded differently when the leader implemented new rules or restrictions. Can you walk me through how that dynamic worked?
Long pause. It was fascinating and terrifying to watch, Tony. People would literally transform overnight when Marcus announced changes. Some would become more devoted, almost grateful for the additional control. Others would withdraw completely.
What kind of changes are we talking about here?
Well, there were the obvious ones. Stricter meal schedules, longer work hours, new prohibitions on certain books or conversations. But then there were the psychological ones, like when he decided that families were becoming too attached to each other and started separating parents from children for spiritual growth.
How did you personally respond to these changes?
I learned to become invisible, Tony. My strategy was to never be the first to comply enthusiastically, but never be the last either. I watched others make those mistakes. The eager ones became his enforcers, losing pieces of themselves. The resistant ones faced consequences that served as warnings to the rest of us.
You're describing a survival mechanism that developed over years.
Exactly. By the time I was in my early 20s, I could read the room within minutes of any announcement. There was this woman, Catherine, who had been there since the beginning. She had this way of tilting her head slightly when she disagreed with something Marcus said. Just, barely perceptible.
What happened to Catherine?
Pause. One day she tilted her head at the wrong moment during a community meeting. Marcus saw it. Within a week she was reassigned to work in the isolation garden, a plot of land about a mile from the main compound, where they sent people to reflect. We rarely saw her after that.
That must have been devastating for the community to witness.
It was calculated, Tony. Marcus understood that we all cared about Catherine. She was like everyone's aunt. By removing her gradually rather than dramatically, he taught us that even beloved members weren't safe if they stepped out of line.
How did watching these dynamics affect your own plans for escape?
It made me realize that I couldn't trust anyone completely. Not even the people I cared about most. There was this man, David, who had been kind to me since I arrived. He would slip me extra food sometimes, check on me when I was sick. I started to develop feelings for him.
That sounds like it provided some comfort during a terrible time.
It did, until Marcus announced that romantic relationships needed his personal approval. David came to me that night and said we had to confess our feelings to Marcus and ask for permission to court properly.
What did you do?
I lied, Tony. I told David that I had been confused, that what I felt wasn't romantic love but spiritual appreciation for his kindness. I watched his face crumble, but I knew that involving Marcus in any personal relationship would give him another tool to control me.
That must have been an incredibly lonely decision.
Voice softening it was, but it also clarified something important for me. I realized that as long as I remained in that place, I would never be able to love anyone freely. Not romantically, not as a friend, not even as family. Every relationship would be filtered through Marcus's approval and manipulation.
Did that realization change how you viewed your fellow community members?
It made me see how trapped we all were in different ways. Some people, like David, were trying to find genuine human connection within the system. Others had given up on connection entirely and just focused on survival. Then there were those who had embraced the system so completely that they became extensions of Marcus himself.
Which category felt most dangerous to you?
The true believers, without question. They were unpredictable because their loyalty wasn't just to Marcus but to their own transformation. They had convinced themselves that suffering was purification, that isolation was enlightenment. You couldn't reason with them because they saw reason itself as a form of spiritual weakness.
How did you maintain your own sense of identity while navigating all these different responses to control?
Long pause. I created a version of myself that could exist in public, and I protected a tiny core of who I really was in complete secrecy. I would lie awake at night and remember my mother's laugh, or the way rain sounded on the roof of our old house. Small things that belonged only to me.
That sounds like an exhausting way to live.
It was the only way to live, Tony. And eventually, that protected part of me grew strong enough to plan my escape.
Sarah, we've talked about the daily life, the rules, the punishments, but I'm curious about something else entirely. What did you miss most from the outside world during those 20 years?
Long pause. You know, Tony, it wasn't what I expected to miss. I thought it would be my friends or movies or music. But what I missed most was choice, just the simple ability to choose what to eat for breakfast, or which book to read, or whether to stay inside or go for a walk.
That's profound. The freedom to make even mundane decisions.
Exactly. In the compound, everything was decided for us. What we wore, when we woke up, who we could speak to, what we could think about. I remember lying in my bunk at night, trying to remember what it felt like to open a refrigerator and choose what I wanted to eat.
How did that constant control affect your sense of self over time?
It erased me, piece by piece. By year 5, I could barely remember the girl who had walked through those gates. By year 10, I wasn't sure if she had ever existed at all. Brother Marcus was very deliberate about that process.
Tell me more about that process, Sarah. How does someone systematically erase another person's identity?
It starts with isolation from anything that reminds you of who you were. Then they flood you with new information, new rules, new ways of thinking. But the most insidious part was the way they made you complicit in your own erasure.
What do you mean by complicit?
They would ask you to confess your past sins, your past thoughts, your past desires. And every time you spoke about your old life, you had to frame it as wrong, as selfish, as spiritually bankrupt. So you're literally training yourself to reject who you used to be.
That's a sophisticated form of psychological manipulation.
Brother Marcus understood human psychology better than most trained therapists. He knew that if he could get us to condemn our past selves with our own words, the conditioning would be much stronger than anything imposed from the outside.
Did you ever have moments where you questioned what was happening to you?
Oh yes, especially in the early years. But questioning was dangerous, Tony. Not just because of the punishments, though those were severe. It was dangerous because doubt was so painful when you had no way out.
How do you mean?
Imagine being trapped in a room with no door, and someone tells you the room is actually a beautiful garden. You can either accept that it's a garden and find some peace, or you can insist it's a prison and live in constant agony. When escape isn't possible, sometimes acceptance feels like survival.
That's a heartbreaking choice to have to make.
The human mind is incredibly adaptable, Tony. Maybe too adaptable. I learned to find small joys within the system. A kind word from another member, a particularly beautiful sunset viewed from the fields, the satisfaction of work well done, and those small joys made me complicit in my own captivity.
Do you feel guilt about that adaptation?
I did for a long time after I escaped. I felt like I had betrayed the 14-year-old girl who first arrived there. She would have been horrified to know that I eventually found ways to be happy in that place.
But wasn't that survival, Sarah? Wasn't that your mind protecting itself?
My therapist says the same thing. She says that finding ways to cope doesn't make me weak or complicit. It makes me human. But it's still difficult to reconcile the person who occasionally smiled in that place with the person who knew it was wrong.
You mentioned your therapist. What's it been like, trying to reclaim your sense of self after 20 years?
It's like archaeological work, Tony. Digging through layers of conditioning to find fragments of who I used to be. But here's the thing I'm learning. I can't just go back to being that 14-year-old girl. She doesn't exist anymore, and that's not entirely a tragedy.
How so?
That girl was naive, sheltered, trusting to a fault. The woman I am now has seen the depths of human manipulation, but I've also seen incredible resilience. I've learned that I can survive things I never imagined possible. There's strength in that knowledge, even though it came at a terrible cost.
You speak about this with such clarity now. Was there a specific moment when you began to reclaim your identity?
It happened gradually, then all at once. For years, I had been having dreams about the outside world, but they weren't memories exactly. They were dreams about walking into a grocery store and spending an entire afternoon reading cereal boxes just because I could.
That's a beautiful image.
One night, maybe 3 years before I escaped, I woke up from one of those dreams and realized something had shifted. I wasn't dreaming about my old life anymore. I was dreaming about a life I had never lived but still somehow deserved.
That sounds like hope beginning to return.
It was terrifying, Tony. Hope was the most dangerous thing you could feel in that place. Hope meant you weren't fully converted. Hope meant you were still fighting the system in your heart.
But you held on to it anyway.
I hid it so deep that sometimes I forgot it was there. But it was like a seed buried under snow, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. And when I finally saw my chance to escape, that hope bloomed into action faster than I could think.
Looking back now, Sarah, do you think that 14-year-old girl would recognize the woman sitting here today?
Pause. I think she would recognize my eyes. Everything else has changed, but my eyes still hold the same curiosity, the same stubborn spark that got me in trouble as a child. Brother Marcus tried to extinguish that spark for 20 years, but it never quite went out.
What do you hope people understand about experiences like yours?
I hope they understand that control doesn't always look like chains and locked doors. Sometimes it looks like community, like belonging, like purpose. The most effective prisons are the ones we help build around ourselves.
That's a sobering thought.
But I also want people to know that the human spirit is more resilient than we imagine. Even after decades of conditioning, some part of us remembers freedom, some part of us remembers choice, and that part, no matter how buried, never stops fighting to surface again.
Sarah, we're going to take a short break, but when we come back, I'd like to talk about your escape and those first days of freedom. Is that something you're prepared to discuss?
Yes, Tony. It's time to tell that part of the story, too.
Sarah, I want to shift our conversation to something that might be difficult to discuss. You mentioned earlier that you had attempted to escape before your final successful attempt. Can you tell me about those earlier tries?
Long pause. There were 3 failed attempts over the years. The first was when I was 17. I was still so naive then, Tony. I thought I could just walk out during the night and hitchhike back to my parents.
What happened?
They caught me before I even reached the main road. The compound was more isolated than I realized, and they had people watching. But it wasn't just the physical barriers that stopped me. It was what happened afterward that really broke something inside me.
How did they punish you?
Isolation. Complete isolation for 2 months in what they called the reflection room. It was barely larger than a closet, Tony. No windows, 1 meal a day, and the only human contact was when Brother Marcus would come in to lecture me about my spiritual sickness.
That sounds like psychological torture.
That's exactly what it was. But here's what haunts me the most about those failed attempts. Each time I was caught, they didn't just punish me, They would gather the entire community and make me confess my sins publicly. They forced me to apologize to everyone for trying to abandon our family.
How did the other members react to these confessions?
Voice breaking slightly. That's the part I struggle with, even now. Some of them looked at me with such disappointment, as if I had personally betrayed them. But others, I could see it in their eyes, Tony. They wanted to run too. There was this woman, Rebecca, who had 2 small children. After my second escape attempt, she started avoiding me completely.
You think she was afraid of being associated with you?
I know she was. But I also think seeing my failed attempts reminded her of her own trapped situation. How do you run when you have 2 little ones? Where do you go? Marcus made sure we all understood that the outside world would destroy us, that we'd never survive without the community.
Tell me about your mindset between these attempts. How did you keep hope alive?
Pause, honestly. There were years when I didn't. After the 3rd failed attempt when I was 26, I fell into what I can only describe as a deep spiritual depression. I started to believe what they were telling me, that I was damaged, that my desire to leave was evidence of my moral corruption.
What changed? What pulled you out of that dark period?
It was actually something small. Insignificant, really. I was working in the communal kitchen, and I found an old newspaper that someone had used to wrap vegetables. It was from the outside world, dated just a few months earlier. There was this article about a woman who had started a literacy program for refugees.
Why did that particular article affect you so deeply?
Because it reminded me that there were good people in the outside world. For so long, Marcus had painted this picture of a world full of violence and moral decay. But here was proof of kindness, of people helping strangers. It made me remember who I used to be before they broke me down.
You mentioned that your final escape was different from the others. What had you learned from those earlier failures?
Patience, mainly, and the importance of planning. My earlier attempts were driven by desperation and emotion. By the time I was 34, I had learned to think strategically. I spent 2 years preparing for that final escape.
2 years?
I slowly gathered information about the outside world whenever I could. I memorized bus routes, saved tiny amounts of money from the little they paid us for our work, and most importantly, I learned to hide my intentions completely. I became the model community member.
That must have required incredible self-control.
The hardest part wasn't fooling Marcus and his inner circle. It was watching other people suffer while I prepared my escape. There was a teenage boy who reminded me so much of myself at that age. He was asking the same questions I had asked, showing the same spirit they eventually crushed in me.
Did you consider trying to help him escape with you?
Long pause every day, Tony. But I knew that if I tried to save him, we'd both end up trapped forever. That's a weight I carry, the knowledge that I saved myself but left others behind.
Do you think you made the right choice?
I had to make the choice that gave me the best chance of survival. And I told myself that if I could get out, I could eventually help others. That's part of why I'm talking to you today.
Sarah, I need to ask you something that might be difficult. In everything you've shared so far, you've talked about your parents handing you over to this commune when you were 14. But there's something in your voice when you mention them that doesn't quite add up for me.
Long pause. What do you mean?
Well, you describe this place as a prison, as psychological torture. Yet when you talk about your parents' decision to send you there, there's almost a protective quality in how you frame it, like you're still shielding them somehow.
I suppose. They thought they were helping me.
Sarah, I've been doing interviews for over 20 years. I've learned to listen not just to what people say, but to what they don't say. What aren't you telling me about your parents' role in all this?
Very long pause. Tony, this is the part I've never told anyone. Not the police, not the therapists, not even myself for the longest time.
Take your time.
My parents didn't just hand me over to what they thought was a religious retreat. They knew exactly what that place was. My father had been there himself as a young man.
He'd been at the commune?
Not just been there. He was one of the founding members. He helped Marcus establish the whole operation back in the early 70s. My father was there for 7 years before he left to get married and start what looked like a normal life.
So when he sent you there,
He was sending me back to his world. The world he'd never really left behind in his mind. All those years growing up, I thought we were just a regular family. But my father was still completely devoted to Marcus's teachings. He'd been waiting for the right moment to bring me into the fold.
and your mother, did she know?
That's what I spent years trying to understand. She knew about my father's past, but I think she believed he'd moved beyond it. When I started having problems in school, getting into trouble, acting out as teenagers do, my father convinced her that Marcus could help me find direction.
What kind of problems were you having?
Nothing serious, really. I was skipping classes, staying out late, dating boys my parents didn't approve of, normal teenage rebellion. But my father saw it as spiritual corruption that needed to be corrected.
So this wasn't a sudden decision for him.
No, Tony. That's what I finally realized after I escaped. He'd been planning this for years. All those family camping trips to remote locations, teaching me to live without modern conveniences, the intense religious discussions at dinner. He was preparing me for life at the compound.
How did you come to understand this? What made you see the full picture?
About a year after I escaped, I finally worked up the courage to confront my mother. She was still alive then, still married to my father. When I told her everything that had happened to me, she broke down completely.
She didn't know the extent of what you'd endured?
She knew some of it. But Tony, here's the part that shattered me. She told me that my father had been going back to visit the commune every few years. He'd been checking on me.
He'd seen you there and left you there.
Multiple times. Marcus would tell me we had visitors for spiritual consultations, important people who were considering joining our community. I never saw these visitors, but they were there. My own father had been watching my deterioration and chose to let it continue.
Sarah, I can't imagine how that revelation affected you.
It changed everything about my story, Tony. All those years, I'd been holding on to this image of my parents as misguided but loving people who'd made a terrible mistake, learning that my father had been an active participant in my imprisonment. That was almost harder to accept than the 20 years I'd lost.
Did you ever confront your father directly?
I tried, but by then, he'd convinced himself that everything that happened to me had been necessary for my spiritual development. He actually thanked me for finally understanding Marcus's wisdom. He thought my escape and survival proved that the teachings had worked.
How do you process that level of betrayal from a parent?
I'm still learning how, Tony. Some days I think the psychological manipulation from Marcus was easier to overcome than accepting that my own father had orchestrated my captivity. At least Marcus never pretended to love me unconditionally.
This puts everything you've shared in a completely different light.
It does. Because it means my imprisonment wasn't just about a cult taking advantage of trusting parents. It was about a father who valued his ideology more than his daughter's freedom.
Sarah, you've described years of isolation, the punishments, the failed escape attempts. But there's something I need to ask you about. When you finally did escape, how exactly did that happen?
Long pause. That's the hardest part to talk about, Tony. Because the truth is, I didn't escape alone.
Someone helped you?
Marcus, the leader's son. He was the one who unlocked my door that night.
The same Marcus who you said enforced the rules, who punished people for questioning his father.
Yes. And I know how that sounds. For years, I hated him. We all did. He was cruel, Tony. He carried out every punishment his father ordered.
But something changed.
I found out why. 3 months before I escaped, I discovered Marcus had been planning to leave for over a year. He'd been stealing supplies, hiding money, mapping escape routes.
He was planning his own escape? So when you were locked up after your last escape attempt?
He came to me, told me everything, said he'd been watching me, that he knew I'd never stop trying to get out. He asked if I wanted to leave with him.
How did that feel, Sarah? Learning that someone you saw as an enemy was actually…
Trying to save us? It broke something in me, Tony. All those years of anger, of seeing him as this monster. He was just as trapped as the rest of us. More trapped, maybe, because he had to become someone he wasn't just to survive.
Did others know about his plan?
A few. The night we left, there were 6 of us total. Marcus had been secretly reaching out to people he trusted, people who'd been there long enough, who'd proven they wouldn't break under pressure.
And his father never suspected?
Marcus played his role perfectly. Right up until the end, his father believed his son was completely loyal. That's what made it possible.
This changes everything about how we understand your story, Sarah. This young man who seemed like your oppressor
Was actually our salvation. Yes, Tony. Sometimes the people we think are our enemies are just doing what they have to do to survive.
Sarah, you mentioned that Marcus had become increasingly paranoid in those final months. What was different about the atmosphere in the compound?
The fear was suffocating Tony. He'd started conducting what he called loyalty assessments, essentially psychological torture sessions where he'd single out members and accuse them of plotting against him. People were disappearing more frequently.
Disappearing?
Into the isolation cells, or worse. We'd stopped asking questions about the ones who never came back. But I knew my time was running out. He'd been watching me more closely, making comments about my rebellious spirit needing correction.
That must have been terrifying. How did you find the courage to plan another escape attempt?
Long pause, desperation mostly. But also something Elena told me years earlier. She said that sometimes the only choice we have is between dying slowly or dying trying to live. I realized I'd been dying slowly for 20 years.
When did you know it was time to act?
The night he announced new purification protocols. He was talking about removing the diseased elements from our community. The way he looked at me when he said it, I knew I had maybe days, not weeks.
How did you prepare mentally for what you knew would be your final attempt?
I stopped thinking about failure, Tony. Every previous escape attempt had been haunted by the fear of getting caught. This time, I accepted that I might die trying. That acceptance was liberating in a way I can't fully explain.
You mentioned you had help this time.
There were others who'd reached their breaking point. Not many, but enough. We started communicating through tiny gestures, shared glances during work detail. Nothing that could be detected, but we knew.
How many others were willing to risk everything?
3 others initially committed, but as the night approached, fear took hold. I understood. The consequences of getting caught had only grown more severe over the years. In the end, it was just me and David.
David had been there as long as you had.
Longer. He'd lost his wife to one of Marcus's correction sessions the year before. He had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. We made a pact. We'd either escape together or die together, but we wouldn't spend another day under Marcus's control.
When did you decide to make your move?
October 15th. The night everything changed forever.
Sarah, you mentioned earlier that something shifted for you in that final year. What was different about your mindset when you started planning what would become your successful escape?
I stopped trying to save everyone else, Tony. For years, I'd been thinking about how to get Marcus out, how to help the other women, how to expose Daniel to the whole group at once. But I realized I couldn't be their savior.
That must have been a painful realization.
It was liberating, actually. I'd been carrying this weight, this responsibility that wasn't mine to carry. I had to accept that I could only save myself. And maybe, if I succeeded, I could help others from the outside.
So your approach changed completely.
Everything changed. I stopped talking about my doubts. I started attending Daniel's sessions with what looked like renewed devotion. I volunteered for extra kitchen duties, garden work, anything that would make me seem committed while giving me access to different parts of the compound.
You were essentially going undercover in your own life.
Pause. Yes, that's exactly what it was. I was playing a role, and it was exhausting. But I'd learned to compartmentalize my real thoughts from what I needed to project. 20 years of survival had taught me that.
What was going through your mind during those final weeks of preparation?
Terror, mostly. Not just fear of getting caught, but fear of succeeding. The outside world felt like another planet, Tony. I'd been 14 when I went in. I didn't know how to use a credit card, how to find an apartment, how to apply for a job. I was planning to escape into a world I didn't understand.
But you pushed forward anyway.
I had this image that kept me going. I'd picture myself sitting in a quiet coffee shop somewhere, reading a newspaper, making my own choices about what to eat, where to go next. Simple things that represented freedom. When the fear got overwhelming, I'd return to that image.
And you started watching for the right opportunity.
I became a student of the compound's rhythms. Guard rotations, supply deliveries, Daniel's schedule. I memorized everything. I knew I'd only get one chance, so I had to be absolutely certain about the timing.
How long did this preparation phase last?
3 months of careful observation and planning. 3 months of pretending to be someone I wasn't while preparing for the most important day of my life.
Sarah, we've talked about your escape, your recovery, but I have to ask about something that might be difficult. What happened to the others you left behind?
Long pause. That's the question that keeps me awake at night, Tony. When I ran through those woods, I wasn't just saving myself. I was abandoning my friends, people who had become family.
You mentioned earlier that some tried to stop you from leaving. How do you reconcile that now?
They were terrified. Marcus had convinced them that the outside world would destroy anyone who left. When they saw me planning to escape, they genuinely believed they were saving my life by reporting me.
That must create an impossible emotional conflict for you.
It does. I'm angry at them, but I also understand them completely. They were victims, too. Just victims who couldn't see the cage anymore. The hardest part is knowing that my escape probably made things worse for everyone else.
What do you mean by worse?
Marcus always punished the group when someone tried to leave. More restrictions, longer work hours, less food. My successful escape would have been seen as a catastrophic failure of their faith, their commitment.
Have you had any contact with anyone still inside?
Voice breaking, no. The FBI raided the compound 6 months after I escaped, but by then it was empty. Marcus had moved them somewhere else. 43 people, Tony. 43 souls just vanished.
Including people you cared about deeply.
Rebecca, who taught me to weave. David, who shared his bread with me when I was being punished. Children who were born there and never knew anything else existed. They're all out there somewhere, and I don't know if they're safe.
Do you ever question whether you should have tried to save them instead of just yourself?
Every single day. But I've learned something important in therapy. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. And sometimes the only way to help people trapped in darkness is to get yourself to the light first.
What does that mean for you now?
It means I keep talking. I keep telling this story. Because somewhere out there, Marcus is still preying on families like mine. And maybe, just maybe, someone will hear this and recognize the warning signs before it's too late.
Before they lose 20 years.
Before they lose everything that makes them who they are.
Sarah, you mentioned there was a moment when something inside you fundamentally changed. Can you tell me about that turning point?
Long pause. It was when they brought in Maya's daughter. She was only 13, Tony, younger than I was when I arrived.
What happened when you saw her?
I watched them strip away her identity, just like they'd done to me. Her confusion, her tears, and I realized I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was complicit by staying silent.
That must have been devastating to recognize.
It was. But it also broke something loose in me. For 20 years, I'd been focused on my own survival. Suddenly, I understood my responsibility to protect someone else.
How did that realization change your approach to escape?
I stopped being careful, stopped protecting myself first. I knew if I didn't act, I'd watch her disappear the same way I had.
That's when you decided to risk everything?
Yes. Because saving her meant saving the part of myself I thought was gone forever.
Sarah, as we wrap up today, I have to ask, what do you want people to take away from your story?
That healing is possible, Tony. Even after 20 years of being told you're nothing, that you're broken, the mind can recover.
You've mentioned starting a foundation to help other survivors. Tell me about that.
We're calling it Second Dawn. There are more people like me out there than you'd think. People who escaped cults, communes, abusive situations. They need somewhere safe to land.
When you look back at that 14-year-old girl who walked into that compound, what would you tell her?
Long pause, that she's stronger than she knows, that her voice matters, that someday she'll use all this pain to help others find their way home.
And what does home mean to you now?
Not a place anymore. It's the freedom to choose, to say no, to wake up each morning and decide who I want to be that day.
Sarah, thank you for your courage in sharing this story.
Thank you for listening, Tony.
Sarah, as we wrap up today, I have to ask, what do you want people to take away from your story?
That these places still exist, Tony, hidden in plain sight, and that healing is possible even after decades of darkness.
You've been free for 8 months now. What does a typical day look like for you?
Soft laugh. I still wake up surprised by choices. What to eat, what to wear, where to go. Simple freedoms most people never think about.
Are you worried about speaking out? About potential retaliation?
Every day. But silence protects them, not us. Other survivors have reached out since the story broke. We're not alone anymore.
What would you say to someone who suspects a loved one is in a similar situation?
Trust your instincts. Don't stop asking questions. And remember, it's never too late to come home.
Sarah, thank you for your courage in sharing this with us.
Thank you for listening, Tony. For all of them who can't speak yet.